26th of July, 1944. The morning fog clung to the hedgerows of Normandy as General Major Fritz Bayerlein stood in the ruins of a French farmhouse, studying maps that meant less with each passing day. His Panzer-Lehr division, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, had been hemorrhaging men and machines since the Americans landed 7 weeks prior. But what gnawed at him wasn't the Allied firepower, it was something else entirely, something his Prussian military education had never prepared him to comprehend. "They eat like kings," reported his intelligence officer, laying photographs on the splintered table. Fresh bread, meat, coffee, chocolate bars. Bayerlein scoffed, pushing the images aside. The photographs showed American soldiers barely off the beaches, some still wearing the grime of Omaha and Utah, yet sitting beside crates of rations that would feed a German company for a week. It seemed impossible. His own men subsisted on black bread and ersatz coffee, their supply lines strangled by Allied bombers and the crumbling infrastructure of the Reich. How could an army that had crossed an ocean be eating better than defenders fighting on their own conquered territory? The German High Command had built its entire strategic doctrine on a simple calculus. America was soft, industrial, but not martial, capable of producing tanks, but not of projecting power across continents. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt himself had dismissed American logistics as amateurish in conversations at headquarters. The Atlantic Wall would hold, they assured themselves, because even if the Allies landed, they could never sustain an army on hostile shores. Napoleon had taught them that amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics. The Germans considered themselves the ultimate professionals. Yet here, in the summer of 1944, something unprecedented was unfolding. The Americans weren't just landing supplies, they were building an industrial empire on French soil. Bayerlein had heard reports from reconnaissance units that seemed like fever dreams, artificial harbors the size of Dover, pipelines being laid across the channel floor, entire port facilities materializing from nothing on beaches that had been killing zones weeks earlier. According to intelligence reports corroborated by the Times of London, in their August 1944 coverage of the invasion's progress, the Allies were landing over 30,000 tons of supplies daily through the Mulberry harbors. Alone, Bayerlein had commanded divisions that operated on a fraction of such abundance. His Panzer-Lehr had entered Normandy with over 100 tanks. Now, 6 weeks later, barely 30 remain operational, not primarily from combat, but from lack of spare parts, fuel, and the relentless aerial bombardment of anything that moved on French roads during daylight. The General Major walked to the farmhouse window, watching the column of his exhausted soldiers trudge past. They looked like ghosts hollow-eyed, their uniforms hanging loose on frames that had once been robust. Across the hedgerows, the Americans were building strength. Fresh divisions arrived weekly, their soldiers well-fed, their equipment gleaming. The German doctrine of lightning war, of blitzkrieg, required speed and surprise. But what the Wehrmacht faced now was something entirely different: the methodical, unstoppable advance of an enemy who could afford to be patient, because they would never run out of bullets, fuel, or breakfast. The contempt was beginning to crack, replaced by something far more dangerous: doubt. 15th of June, 1944. 9 days after the initial landings, Lieutenant General John C.H. Lee stood on Omaha Beach and saw not carnage, but possibility. The sand was still stained dark in places. Debris from the assault scattered like toys abandoned by violent children. Yet already the transformation had begun. Engineers worked in controlled chaos, their movements purposeful as they erected the scaffolding of what would become the largest logistical operation in military history. Lee commanded the communications zone, the unglamorous but vital organization responsible for everything behind the front lines. While generals like George Patton grabbed headlines, with armored thrusts, Lee orchestrated something more profound: the systematic conversion of war-torn France into an extension of American industrial might. His mandate was simple and impossible: keep an army of millions fed, armed, and mobile across an ocean. The skeptics had been numerous. British planners, veterans of 3 years of European fighting, had cautioned that the Americans were attempting something beyond human capability. Even within the U.S. Army, voices questioned whether the logistics tail would strangle the combat teeth. War Department studies projected that for every soldier fighting, 8 more would be needed in support roles. The ratio seemed absurd until one considered what was being attempted. Captain Robert Littlejohn, the chief quartermaster, explained it to visiting congressmen with characteristic bluntness: "Gentlemen, we are feeding more people in France than live in the 15 largest American cities combined, and we're doing it 3,000 miles from home." The numbers told a story that German commanders refused to believe. By late June, according to U.S. Army historical records and contemporary reporting from Stars and Stripes military newspaper, American forces were consuming 15,000 tons of supplies daily: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, spare parts, and 10,000 other necessities from shoelaces to typewriter ribbons. Each infantryman required 66 pounds of supplies per day to remain combat effective. Armored divisions required 4 times that amount per soldier. Lee's engineers had solved the harbor problem with typical American pragmatism. If natural ports weren't available, they would build artificial ones. The Mulberry Harbors, conceived in 1943 and constructed in absolute secrecy across Britain, were technological marvels: enormous concrete casings towed across the channel and sunk to create breakwaters, floating pier heads that rose and fell with tides, roadways spanning from beach to deep water. Each Mulberry could handle 7,000 tons daily. But it wasn't just infrastructure. The American logistics machine operated on principles foreign to European military thinking. Standardization was sacred. Every Jeep used the same parts. Every rifle fired the same cartridge. Redundancy was built into every system. When one supply route was cut, 3 alternatives existed. Depots were organized with industrial efficiency, inspired more by Sears Roebuck warehouses than military tradition. In a supply dump near St. Mary-Glise, Private Daniel Hernandez from Newark supervised the distribution of rations. "We got 37 million meals waiting here," he told a reporter from the New York Herald Tribune, "and more coming every hour. The boats don't stop." The boats indeed didn't stop. Liberty ships, built in American yards at a rate of 3 per day, crossed the Atlantic in convoys. Each vessel carried 10,000 tons ammunition stacked in holds, vehicles lashed to decks, food preserved in ways that would have seemed like alchemy to previous generations. Refrigerated ships brought fresh meat. Tankers brought fuel. Hospital ships returned with wounded, were cleaned, and made the crossing again. What the Germans dismissed as American extravagance was actually calculated strategy. Well-fed soldiers fought better, longer, and recovered faster. Mechanics with proper tools repaired tanks overnight instead of losing them to mechanical failure. Artillery with abundant ammunition could pulverize defensive positions before infantry advanced. The machine was awakening, and it was hungry. 20-5th of August, 1944. As Paris celebrated liberation, a more critical drama unfolded along the roads of northern France. The Allied breakout from Normandy had succeeded beyond expectations. Patton's Third Army was racing east, British and Canadian forces pushing north, the German Wehrmacht in full retreat. But success brought its own crisis. The supply lines couldn't keep pace with the advance. The solution was born of desperation and audacity: the Red Ball Express, a highway system dedicated exclusively to military transport, from St. to Paris and beyond. Convoys of trucks would run continuously, 24 hours a day, carrying the lifeblood of the advancing armies. No civilian traffic, no exceptions, no stops except for fuel, mechanical failure, or enemy action. Lieutenant Charles Stevenson, a logistics officer from Philadelphia, described the operation in his journal. "We have requisitioned every truck in the European theater. The roads belong to us now. One way up, loaded. One way back, empty. The circle never stops." Approximately 75% of the Red Ball drivers were African American soldiers, men assigned to transportation duties in a still segregated army. They drove GMC 6x6s and Jimmies, lumbering trucks that could carry 5 tons of cargo on roads never designed for such punishment. The work was grueling and dangerous, not from enemy fire, though that remained a threat, but from exhaustion, mechanical failure, and the sheer relentlessness of the operation. Corporal James Turner from Alabama had driven for 36 hours straight when the Stars and Stripes correspondent found him at a fuel stop outside Chartres. "They tell us Patton's boys are 60 miles ahead and out of gas. We're the gas. We're the bullets. We're the reason they keep moving." His eyes were bloodshot, his hands steady on a cup of coffee that had been hot and out before. "Germans think they can starve us out. They ain't met American truckers yet." The statistics were staggering. At the Red Ball's peak in September 1944, as noted in official U.S. Army Transportation Corps records, over 6,000 trucks operated continuously, carrying 12,500 tons of supplies daily. The trucks burned an ocean of fuel, themselves gasoline to carry gasoline, a logistics paradox that somehow worked through sheer volume and determination. Every 24 hours, Approximately 140 trucks broke down or were damaged beyond field repair. Maintenance units worked in shifts, cannibalizing parts from irreparable vehicles to keep others running. Tire shortages became critical as the French roads, damaged by years of war, shredded rubber at alarming rates. Engineers laid temporary roads, but the trucks often drove around them, choosing speed over preservation. The German response revealed their incomprehension. Luftwaffe pilots, now rare in skies dominated by Allied fighters, reported endless truck columns in intelligence debriefs. Wehrmacht commanders read these reports with disbelief. Their own supply system relied on horses. Over 2.7 million horses in German service, eating grain that could have fed soldiers, moving at speeds that cavalry had used for centuries. The contrast wasn't merely technological, it was philosophical. By early September, forward elements of Third Army were 300 miles from the Normandy beaches. That same distance had taken Napoleon weeks to traverse with careful supply planning. The British Expeditionary Force in 1914 had ground to a halt at far shorter distances. Yet here, in autumn 1944, American soldiers could still expect 3 meals a day, clean water, mail from home, and enough ammunition to fight continuously. The Red Ball Express would operate until November, replaced by restored rail lines and captured ports. In its brief existence, it delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies. But more than tonnage, it delivered something the Germans couldn't quantify, the absolute certainty that no American soldier would be abandoned, that the chain from factory to foxhole remained unbroken. The roads ran red with the balls of paint marking exclusive routes, and through those arteries flowed the blood of industrial democracy. 3rd of October, 1944, at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, a building that had witnessed the humiliation of Germany. In 1919 now hosted its potential salvation or doom, depending on perspective. British and American officers gathered for supply conferences that would determine the war's trajectory more surely than any battle. The maps on the walls told competing stories. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group pushed into Belgium and Holland, aimed like a dagger toward the Ruhr industrial heartland. Further south, Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group, including Patton's rampaging 3rd Army, threatened the Saar and the approaches to the Rhine. Both commanders demanded priority for supplies. Both believed they could end the war by Christmas. Brigadier General Raymond Moses, Deputy Chief of Staff for Supply, faced an impossible equation. Gentlemen, he addressed the assembled commanders, we can support a single Army group in sustained offensive operations, or we can support both Army groups in limited operations. We cannot do both simultaneously at current supply levels. The American war machine, for all its might, had encountered the tyranny of distance. Cherbourg and the Normandy beaches, once considered adequate, were now hundreds of miles behind the front lines. The great Belgian port of Antwerp had fallen intact on September 4th. It remained unusable because the Scheldt estuary leading to it remained in German hands. Until Antwerp opened, every bullet, every K-ration, every gallon of fuel traveled by road. Major General Robert Littlejohn, Chief Quartermaster of the European Theater, presented figures that would have seemed fantastical in any previous war. According to records preserved in the National Archives, and cited in Rick Atkinson's The Guns at Last Light, the Allied armies in Europe required 65,000 tons of supplies daily by October 1944. Of that, 20,000 tons was fuel, 12,000 tons ammunition, 8,000 tons food. The remainder encompassed everything from medical supplies to engineering equipment to replacement clothing. We are consuming supplies at rates that exceed our ability to deliver them forward. Littlejohn reported, 3rd Army alone requires over 650,000 gallons of gasoline daily for sustained offensive operations. We are delivering approximately half that amount. Patton's response, when informed of these limitations, became legendary. My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas. It was bravado, but it reflected a deeper truth. The American way of war depended on mobility, and mobility demanded fuel above all else. The Germans observed the supply crisis with renewed hope. Intelligence summaries reaching Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's headquarters noted that American offensive momentum had slowed dramatically in September and early October. Perhaps the optimistic projections had been correct after all. Perhaps the logistics tail would indeed strangle the combat teeth, as Prussian military theory predicted. What German intelligence failed to comprehend was the scale of American response. In ports across Britain and America, ships waited to discharge cargo. In American factories, Production continued at wartime tempo. The problem wasn't supply generation, but supply distribution, and American engineers approached distribution problems with the same industrial mentality they applied to everything else. At a supply depot near Liege, Lieutenant Colonel William Whipple oversaw an operation that resembled a Detroit assembly line, more than a traditional military warehouse. "We handle 15,000 different items," he explained to a visiting delegation from the War Department. "Every item has a stock number, a designated location, and a scheduled distribution plan. We know what's needed before units know they need it." The depot operated around the clock. 3 shifts of soldiers and civilian employees moving supplies with mechanical precision. Forklifts, a relatively new innovation, moved pallets that would have required dozens of men to handle manually. Conveyor systems sorted supplies by destination. Everything was documented, tracked, and accounted for. This was warfare, as no previous generation had conceived it. Victory determined not by martial valor alone, but by spreadsheets, cargo capacities, and the ability to move mountains of material across continents. The Germans had studied Clausewitz and Moltke. The Americans had studied Henry Ford and Frederick Taylor. Both were forms of genius, but only one matched the demands of industrial age total war. By late October, as the battle to open Antwerp intensified, the arithmetic was becoming clear. Whichever side could master logistics would master the war. 20-8th of November, 1944, the Scheldt estuary, that tortuous waterway connecting Antwerp to the North Sea, finally ran clear of German defenders. Canadian forces had fought with desperate intensity through the flooded polders of Walcheren Island, paying in blood for every yard. Now, after 3 months of German denial, the port that could save the Allied offensive lay open for business. Antwerp wasn't just any port, it was the second largest port in Europe, with 29 miles of waterfront, 600 cranes, and facilities that could handle an almost unlimited tonnage. British and American planners had coveted it since long before D-Day, recognizing that without Antwerp's capacity, the advance into Germany would eventually starve. Major General Frank Ross commanded the port's operations, and he approached the task with the mindset of a man building a corporation, rather than managing a military installation. On the first day of operations, December 1st, 1944, he gathered his staff and laid out expectations that seemed absurd. Within 90 days, this port will handle more cargo than all American ports handled in any single month before Pearl Harbor. The transformation began immediately. Military police established traffic control systems of mind-boggling complexity. Roads were designated one-way for miles. Railroad sidings received repair crews that worked through darkness and rain. Warehouses were requisitioned, organized, and integrated into a supply network that stretched back to the American Midwest. German demolitions had been extensive, but superficial. The infrastructure that mattered survived. Within the first week, Liberty ships began arriving in convoy, their hulls pregnant with the material that would resume the offensive. Stevedores, many of them civilian volunteers from America and Britain, worked alongside military personnel. A competitive spirit emerged between shifts which could offload more tonnage, which could maintain the highest pace. Records fell daily. By January 1945, according to U.S. Army port operations reports and contemporary accounts in the Daily Telegraph, Antwerp was handling over 23,000 tons of cargo daily, more than all other European ports combined. The bottleneck that had nearly paralyzed Allied operations had been obliterated through industrial-scale organization. Captain Harold Larson, a port operations officer from Seattle, understood the historical significance. "What we're doing here has never been done before," he told a naval correspondent. "We're not supporting an army, we're supporting a nation at war, 3,000 miles from home, fighting on the front simultaneously. Ancient Rome couldn't have imagined this. Napoleon would have called it impossible." The supplies flowing through Antwerp revealed the scope of American industrial mobilization. Ammunition arrived in quantities that shocked even experienced officers. By February 1945, artillery ammunition stocks exceeded 100 million rounds. Food supplies included not just basic rations, but luxury items meant to maintain morale: cigarettes, candy, coffee, and even ice cream making equipment. Medical supplies filled warehouses: whole blood, plasma, penicillin, surgical instruments in quantities sufficient to staff hospitals serving entire cities. But Antwerp's strategic value extended beyond mere capacity. Its location on the northern European coast meant shorter road distances to front lines. Trucks that had been driving 300 miles from Cherbourg now drove 100 miles from Antwerp. Fuel consumption dropped. Vehicle wear decreased. The same truck fleet could make 3 trips in the time formerly required for one. The Germans recognized what Antwerp's opening meant for their strategic position. On December 16, 1944, Hitler launched his last great gamble in the West, the Ardennes offensive, forever known as the Battle of the Bulge. Among the offensive's objectives was the recapture of Antwerp. If the port could be seized or even heavily damaged, the Allied offensive would collapse, or so German planners hoped. The offensive failed, crushed under the weight of American firepower and, critically, American logistics. During the desperate weeks of December and January, American forces surrounded in Bastogne received aerial resupply. Armored divisions rushed to contain the German penetration, their fuel trucks right behind them. Artillery ammunition was expended at rates that would have bankrupted any previous army. Yet the guns never fell silent for lack of shells. Antwerp continued operations throughout the crisis. Ships continued unloading. Trains continued rolling. The convoys continued eastward. At a fuel dump outside Brussels, tens of millions of gallons sat ready for immediate dispatch. At ammunition depots, mountains of shells awaited guns that fired without pause. The Germans had gambled everything on disrupting the supply system. Instead, they discovered that the system had no single point of failure. It was too vast, too redundant, too thoroughly organized to be meaningfully disrupted. The Wehrmacht learned a harsh lesson that winter. In modern war, production capacity and logistics infrastructure determine outcomes more surely than tactical brilliance. 19th of January, 1945. In a windswept field near Verdun, Private Thomas Chan from San Francisco opened his morning ration and experienced a small miracle that would have been incomprehensible to soldiers throughout human history. The scrambled eggs were warm, the coffee was hot, and the bacon actual bacon, not ersatz, not preserved beyond recognition, tasted like home. Chen was one of over 4 million Allied soldiers in Europe that winter, and somehow, incredibly, the United States Army Quartermaster Corps managed to feed them all. This wasn't survival rations or siege food, this was industrial-scale catering that maintained nutritional standards carefully calculated by scientists back home. Colonel Paul Logan, chief of subsistence for the European theater, operated from an office that resembled a food company headquarters, more than a military installation. "We are the largest restaurant chain on earth," he explained to a delegation from the Department of Agriculture. "We serve 14 million meals weekly, and every meal must meet specific nutritional requirements." The K-ration, that much maligned but revolutionary innovation, represented American pragmatism at its finest. Developed by physiologist Ansel Keys at the University of Minnesota, each ration provided 3,000 calories, balanced proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, and included supplementary items from cigarettes to toilet paper. Soldiers complained about the monotony, but no American army had ever been so consistently fed in the field. More impressive were the rear area messes, where combat-weary soldiers rotated for rest. These installations served hot meals that wouldn't have shamed a civilian cafeteria: roasted meat, fresh vegetables when available, bread baked daily, desserts, milk. According to nutritional studies conducted by the Army Medical Corps and referenced in Mary Louise Roberts' What Soldiers Do, American troops in Europe consumed an average of 4,100 calories daily, more than any army in history and more than most civilians in Allied nations during wartime. The infrastructure required to accomplish this was staggering. Bakery companies, each equipped with field ovens capable of producing 5,000 loaves daily, operated across France and Belgium. Meat processing units butchered livestock requisitioned from local farmers, supplemented by frozen meat from America. Coffee roasting companies ensured that frontline soldiers received coffee fresh enough to actually taste of coffee rather than bitter darkness. At a quartermaster depot near Nancy, refrigerated warehouses held enough frozen meat to feed a city for months. Master Sergeant Edward Morrison, a butcher from Chicago in civilian life, supervised operations that processed 10,000 pounds of meat daily. "We cut for hospitals, for field kitchens, for general messes. We do roasts, steaks, ground meat, everything. And it all has to meet USDA standards, same as back home." The obsessive focus on food quality was a mere extravagance. It was strategic calculation. Studies demonstrated that well-fed soldiers maintained better morale, recovered faster from wounds and illness, and performed more effectively in combat. Conversely, malnourished troops suffered increased casualties, higher disease rates, and psychological breakdown. German prisoners, when fed American rations, reacted with disbelief, Obergefreiter Huntsmuller, captured during the Bulge, later recalled, "They gave us white bread, meat, vegetables, real coffee. We thought it was special treatment, maybe propaganda, that we saw this was what every American ate every day. We understood then that we could not win." The contrast with German rations was deliberate and exploited for psychological warfare. Leaflets dropped over German lines advertised American food. Radio broadcasts described meals in detail. When German soldiers surrendered, often half-starved, the first thing they received was hot food in quantity. The propaganda value was immense, but the operational value was greater. Every German soldier who surrendered was one fewer defender, and well-fed prisoners caused fewer management problems. By February 1945, the supply system had achieved such efficiency that special requests could be accommodated. Jewish soldiers received kosher rations for Passover. Thanksgiving dinner included turkey with all traditional accompaniments. Shipped frozen from America, Christmas brought luxuries that seemed absurd in the middle of history's largest war: fruitcake, candy, nuts, even champagne for officer messes. Supply Sergeant William Rodriguez from Texas supervised a ration distribution point and understood the deeper meaning. Every hot meal tells our boys that America hasn't forgotten them. They're not alone out here. The whole country is behind them all the way. The Germans had built their army on martial tradition and warrior spirit. The Americans built theirs on industrial capacity and the conviction that no soldier should suffer deprivation if technology and organization could prevent it. 14th of March, 1945. In a quartermaster depot outside Reims, Technical Sergeant Rose Thompson collapsed over her typewriter. After 30 hours of continuous duty, the young woman from Ohio had been processing supply requisitions, coordinating shipments, and managing inventory databases without rest since a German Vita rocket had destroyed a forward supply dump, requiring immediate reorganization of distribution schedules. The American logistics miracle wasn't purely mechanical, it was profoundly human. Behind every statistic, every ton of supplies, every mile of highway lay thousands of individuals working past exhaustion to maintain systems that could never be allowed to fail. These were the invisible soldiers, the ones whose names would never appear in glory chronicles, but whose labor made victory possible. The communications zone employed over 600,000 personnel by spring 1945. Men and women from every American state and dozens of allied nations. They included truck drivers, warehouse workers, railroad operators, telephone technicians, clerks, cooks, mechanics, medics, and hundreds of other specialties. Some handled weapons daily. Others never touched a rifle throughout their service. All were essential. Private First Class Samuel Washington drove a supply truck for the Red Ball Express until his vehicle struck a mine near Bastogne in January 1945. He survived the explosion, but lost his right leg. At a hospital in Paris, he told an army nurse, "We weren't supposed to be heroes. We were just supposed to keep things moving. But the mines and the Luftwaffe and the weather, they didn't care what our job description said." The casualty figures for logistics personnel rarely made headlines, but they accumulated steadily. Vehicle accidents on ice-covered roads, enemy artillery fire on supply depots, air raids on ports, disease from overwork and exposure, these claim lives as surely as combat, if less dramatically. The Transportation Corps alone suffered over 3,000 casualties during the European campaign, according to historical records maintained by the Army Center of Military History. Women served throughout the supply system, particularly in communications and administration. The Women's Army Corps, initially viewed with skepticism by traditional officers, proved indispensable. Lieutenant Jane Morrison commanded a postal battalion that processed over 200,000 pieces of mail daily, maintaining the psychological connection between soldiers and home. Mail is ammunition, Morrison explained to visiting officials from Washington. A letter from home can keep a soldier fighting when nothing else will. We deliver mail to foxholes if necessary. The Germans could shell us, they could bomb us, but the mail always went through. The African American soldiers, who comprised such a large percentage of logistics personnel, faced not only the dangers of war, but also the indignities of racism within their own army. Segregated units, inferior facilities, limited promotion opportunities, the contradictions were glaring and bitter. Yet their contribution was irreplaceable. The quartermaster companies, port battalions, and truck companies staffed predominantly by black soldiers literally kept the army moving. Corporal James Walker, interviewed by the Chicago Defender newspaper in February 1945, expressed both pride and frustration. "We're doing the work that wins wars. Not the glamorous stuff, but the necessary stuff. Maybe someday America will appreciate that soldiering isn't just about firing guns. It's about showing up every day and doing your job right, no matter what. Walker's comments reflected a broader sentiment among black service members who performed exemplary service while enduring second-class treatment. The psychological toll of logistics work was underestimated by planners. Combat soldiers faced terror in concentrated doses, followed by periods of relative calm. Logistics personnel faced unrelenting pressure with no respite. The supplies had to move every day, regardless of exhaustion, weather, or casualties. Nervous breakdowns, though rarely discussed publicly, occurred with troubling frequency among supply personnel by spring 1945. At a rest facility near Versailles, Army psychiatrist Captain David Klein treated soldiers suffering from what we would now recognize as burnout. They feel tremendous guilt for wanting rest, Klein observed in his clinical notes. They believe that complaining about exhaustion is weakness, that they're letting down combat troops who face worse conditions. The psychological burden of being responsible for others' lives, indirectly but constantly, creates immense stress. By April 1945, as Allied armies crossed the Rhine and drove into Germany's heartland, the supply system operated with machine-like efficiency. But machines don't feel exhaustion, fear, or pride. The people who made the system function did. They were clerks who hadn't slept properly in months, drivers who navigated by instinct on roads they'd memorized, warehouse workers whose hands were permanently calloused from handling endless crates. Their excellence had a price, paid in sleep deprivation, damaged health, psychological strain, and sometimes death. Victory would be theirs too, but recognition would take decades. 8th of May, 1945. In the ruins of Berlin, the Wehrmacht's last defenders finally surrendered. Victory in Europe was complete. In scattered locations across the defeated Reich, German officers absorbed their defeat and, in many cases, confronted uncomfortable truths about why their armies had failed. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, signing the final surrender documents at Reims, was asked by an American intelligence officer what had surprised him most about American military capability. His answer was revealing. "We were prepared for your courage, your numbers. We expected your air power and your artillery. We did not comprehend that you would turn logistics itself into a weapon. You fought us with supply chains." The historical verdict was beginning to form even before the guns fell silent. The German military machine, for all its tactical brilliance and operational excellence, had lost to an enemy that mastered the unglamorous science of moving supplies. The Blitzkrieg had conquered territories, but couldn't sustain armies across those territories. The Americans had built a system that could. At the Pentagon, the Army Service Forces compiled final statistics that documented the scope of achievement. Between June 1944 and May 1945, American forces in Europe had consumed over 18 million tons of supplies, approximately 5.5 tons per soldier per month. They had transported these supplies across an ocean, through hostile waters, and over hundreds of miles of damaged infrastructure. The Wehrmacht had fought on interior lines, on friendly or conquered territory, with theoretically shorter supply routes. Yet German soldiers had starved while Americans complained about the monotony of their rations. The strategic bombers that pulverized German factories and transportation networks had contributed enormously to this disparity, but bombing alone didn't explain American abundance. That flowed from industrial capacity, organizational genius, and a fundamentally different conception of warfare. German military philosophy emphasized decisive battle and operational maneuver. American philosophy, forged in the Industrial Revolution, emphasized systems and sustainability. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, interrogated at length by American officers after the war, acknowledged this distinction. "You did not outfight us in most engagements. Your individual soldiers were not superior to ours. Your generals were not more brilliant. But you created conditions in which tactical brilliance became irrelevant. When the enemy can always bring more ammunition than you possess, more fuel than you can burn, and more food than his army can consume, classical military principles cease to apply." The Red Ball Express had transported over 400,000 tons during its operation. Antwerp had processed over 4 million tons through the war's end. The Quartermaster Corps had served over 1 billion hot meals. These numbers represented not just logistical achievement, but philosophical revolution, the transformation of war from an art form practiced by military aristocracies into a science practiced by industrial democracies. The implications extended far beyond World War II. The Cold War, which began before the Hot War smoke cleared, would be won or lost based on economic systems and production capacity rather than battlefield heroics. American military doctrine would forever after prioritize logistics, recognizing that sustainable projection of power mattered more than temporary advantage. The human cost remained substantial and often unacknowledged. The supply personnel who made victory possible rarely received medals for valor. Their combat was against distances, tonnages, and schedules rather than enemy soldiers. Yet without them, every tank would have stood immobile, every artillery piece silent, every soldier hungry. In June 1945, Private Thomas Chen, the soldier who had marveled at hot breakfast in January, walked through a captured German supply depot. The contrast was devastating: bare shells, ersatz substitutes, evidence of deprivation that had crippled the Wehrmacht's fire resistance. He found a handwritten note in German, translated later: "Americans eat steak, we eat air. How can we win?" The answer was simple and profound: they couldn't. The German commanders who had scoffed at American supply chains had learned the ultimate military lesson: logistics isn't everything in war, but without logistics, everything else is nothing. The Americans hadn't just fed an army fresh off the beaches. They had demonstrated that industrial capacity, properly organized and relentlessly applied, could overwhelm even the most skilled military tradition. The beaches of Normandy were thousands of miles behind now. The supply depots, the truck convoys, the port facilities were already beginning the massive process of reversal, sending armies home rather than forward. But the lesson remained permanent. In modern warfare, victory belongs not to the swiftest or the strongest, but to those who can sustain strength across continents and time. The American supply chain hadn't just supported victory, it had guaranteed it. From the moment the first Liberty ship crossed the Atlantic until the last Wehrmacht soldier surrendered, the Germans had studied war as art. The Americans had practiced it as engineering. History rendered its verdict, on which approach suited the 20th century.